The shriek of tearing metal cracked across the frozen silence like a thunderclap. A shuttle spiraled down from the storm-choked sky of Throws V, belching smoke and fire, before smashing into a jagged ice ridge with a groaning impact that shattered hull panels and flung debris across the valley. The wind swallowed the sound seconds later, leaving only the hiss of steam and the eerie creak of settling wreckage. Inside what remained of the shuttle's forward cabin, a pale light flickered from a cracked console. One of the seats hissed as a safety restraint retracted and a figure slumped forward. Groaning, Flint Weller squinted against the sting of blood trickling into his eye. He reached up, fingers shaky, and touched his temple. A gash, not deep but messy. He blinked rapidly, forcing his vision to clear. The cabin smelled of burnt insulation and ozone. He coughed and groaned again. "Status report," came a voice to his left, high-pitched and accented with an urgency that didn't quite match its mechanical tone. Flint turned his head slowly. "I'm alive," he muttered. "Thanks for asking, Doran." Doran, a tall, angular alien with bioluminescent patterns flickering weakly across his skin, was struggling to unbuckle his harness. He gave up and sliced through the straps with a short arc tool, then stumbled over to Flint. "You are bleeding and concussed. We must exit the craft before structural failure increases." Doran's tone was clipped, but his hands moved carefully as he helped Flint stand. "I thought you said this was a routine field survey," Flint said, wincing as he put weight on his right leg. "What kind of school sends students into blizzards with faulty navigation?" "University of Interstellar Studies," Doran replied. "We are expected to adapt," Flint snorted. "Great motto. Help me find the others." They moved through the broken craft, crunching over fragments of ice and paneling. Two other students, Yilna, a plant-like being with fibrous limbs, and Hesk, a quadruped with scanning nodules instead of eyes, were both alive but dazed. Yilna had a sprained appendage, and Hesk's internal stabilizer had cracked during impact. Outside, the wind howled across the ice plains, a blinding wash of white stretching to the infinite horizon. No vegetation, no signs of shelter. The air was breathable but thin. The shuttle's beacon was fried. Flint stood at the jagged opening of the hull, squinting into the storm. "We need to find cover. We can't stay here." "There is a glacial cavern network 3 kilometers south," Doran said, checking his wrist interface. "We may reach it before hypothermia begins." 3 kilometers in this. Flint exhaled and shifted his weight, testing the pain in his leg. "Let's move before it gets worse." They set out, Flint using a broken strut as a walking stick. The wind sliced through his emergency suit. He kept his head down, focused on each step. Doran helped guide Hesk, whose balance was off. Yilner wrapped her limbs around herself, her photosynthetic tissues darkening in the cold. After nearly an hour, they stumbled into a narrow crevice that opened into a frozen tunnel. Inside, the wind dropped. The air was still bitter but breathable. They collapsed against the icy walls. No food. "No heat source, no communication," Yilna said flatly. "This is unacceptable." Flint looked around the cavern, his breath fogging in the air. "We need fire." "There is no combustion on Throws V," Doran said, tapping his interface again. "Atmospheric oxygen is insufficient to maintain open flame." Flint reached into the emergency pack strapped to his back. "We're not going to burn the air. We'll burn whatever we can find in here." He dug around until his fingers closed around his old hiking lens, an antique, convex glass he carried more out of habit than need. He turned it in his gloved hands, then looked up at the ice ceiling. Weak, filtered light gleamed from above where the storm thinned. "Give me some twigs," he said. "There are no trees here," Hesk said flatly. From the crash, the storage compartment, some packing materials were wood composite. "I saw it." Doran blinked, then turned and climbed back toward the shuttle. He returned 15 minutes later with a bundle of wooden struts and compressed plant packing. Flint arranged it into a small pyramid, then held the lens above it, angling toward the shaft of light. "It will not work," Yilna said. "There is insufficient solar radiation for ignition." "Just give it a minute," Flint said, his breath shallow. They waited. A tiny wisp of smoke curled upward. Flint adjusted the angle. After several tense seconds, a small ember glowed in the shredded plant fibers. He leaned down and blew gently. The ember caught, spread, and then the twigs began to crackle. Yulner recoiled slightly. "It is alive." "No," Flint said, grinning through cracked lips. "It's fire." The flickering flame cast orange light across the cavern, throwing alien shadows against the walls. The temperature around them rose noticeably. Hesk moved closer, his sensors twitching. "You created thermal energy from a lens and dead matter," Doran said, his voice low with disbelief. "With no power source." "It's basic physics," Flint said, feeding another twig into the flame. "Focus light, burn dry stuff. It's not magic, just science. But you carried the lens." "Why?" Doran asked. "Because sometimes things go wrong." They sat around the fire silent except for the crackle of burning twigs. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, for the first time since the crash, there was comfort. Later that night, Flint's leg throbbed worse. He pulled up the suit leg. The swelling was ugly. Doran scanned it with his device. "Fracture suspected," Doran said. "I lack medical tools." Flint winced. "Splint it. We'll deal with it later." Doran used metal rods from the wreckage and strips of thermal fabric to bind the leg. Flint bit down on a strip of leather during the process. He didn't scream, but his face went pale. "You should rest," Yulna said. "We will monitor the fire." Flint nodded weakly, leaning back against the cavern wall. The fire's warmth lulled him into a light sleep, broken by cold drafts and pain jolts from his leg. He dreamed of home forests, warmth, and a campfire flickering under starlight. The next morning, the fire was low but still alive. Doran had maintained it through the night using strips of composite and scavenged paneling. Flint groaned as he sat up. His leg was stiff, the pain sharper. Doran scanned again. "Hairline fracture. Stable. You must not walk." "Great," Flint muttered. "Guess I'm not hiking out." "We will go," Hesk said. "Retrieve long-range beacon from secondary pod, 20 kilometers east." "You'll freeze," Flint said. "We will not. Our biology is adapted for cryogenic exposure." Flint nodded. "Take the lens." "You can make more fires." Doran looked at the glass, hesitant. "We do not know how." Flint leaned forward. "You saw me do it. Practice before you leave. If you get stuck in a storm, that fire might be the only thing keeping you alive." Doran practiced for an hour. On the 5th attempt, a new fire sparked. That afternoon, the trio left, leaving Flint with enough wood for 2 more nights. He rationed it carefully. The pain in his leg worsened, and he fought a low fever from infection. He boiled melted ice in a metal panel and sterilized the wrappings as best he could. On the 3rd day, the fire flickered dangerously low. He fed it the last of the packing fibers. His breaths came shallow now. He leaned closer to the flames, absorbing every bit of heat. Then, echoing through the ice tunnels, came a low vibration. A hum growing louder, Flint grabbed a metal rod and forced himself to sit upright. His vision swam. A beam of light burst into the cavern. Doran stepped in, followed by 2 others' rescue crew in insulated suits. "We got the beacon working," Doran said. "Help has arrived." Flint sagged in relief. One of the rescuers knelt beside him and examined the splint. "You did this yourself," Doran helped, Flint said, wincing as they adjusted the leg. "You'll need proper care. We'll stabilize you for transport." As they lifted him onto a stretcher, Doran stepped close and held up the cracked lens. "We will study this, your method. It may become standard for survival training." Flint managed a weak grin. "Glad to contribute." They carried him out into the pale sunlight toward a transport ship humming in the distance. Behind them, the little fire guttered out, its smoke curling into the cold. Snow crunched under insulated boots as the rescue crew carried Flint through the narrow mouth of the ice cavern. The transport ship sat parked on a flat shelf of compacted snow, its landing struts half buried. The engines hummed low, radiating faint warmth that melted a small perimeter around it. Flint squinted against the glare, eyes watering, breath shallow. Every bump sent sharp pulses up his leg. The lead rescuer, a squat, broad-shouldered being with a neck lengthened by cartilage rings, adjusted his grip. "You're heavier than expected." "Thanks," Flint muttered. They loaded him into the med bay at the rear of the vessel. Thin lights flickered on above, while a gentle vibration rumbled beneath the floor. One of the medics, a biped with translucent skin and internal organs visible in shifting color, leaned over him with a scanner. "Temperature's dropping below safe range," she said. "Pulses erratic. Let's stabilize before moving." "No sedatives," Flint said, jaw tight. "Not until I know the leg's set right." She paused. "You're conscious enough to make demands, just enough. You don't want to see me groggy and bleeding." She didn't argue. Instead, she gestured to a surgical drone which hovered closer and extended a set of retractable tools. Flint flinched. "Don't let that thing do anything without explaining," he said. "I know what a misplaced splint can do." The medic narrowed her eyes, then loaded the scan into a projection. "Fractures mid-tibia, minor displacement, ligament strain at the knee, no compound exposure, will numb the area, reduce manually, then immobilize." "That's better," Flint said. "I've had worse." "I'm not surprised." Doran stood in the doorway, his skin patterns pulsing faintly in the warmed environment. He carried a sealed container under one arm. The medic noticed and frowned. "No samples until we finish stabilization." "It is not a sample." "It is his artifact," Flint sighed. "It's a lens, not ancient, just old." Doran looked at him. "You said it was habit, but why carry such a thing in modern transit? Because it doesn't run out of charge, it doesn't glitch. And when things go wrong, you need something that works every time." The medic injected a local anesthetic around the leg and waited. Flint's breathing slowed as the pain dulled. "Ready," she said, nodding to the assistant. They moved with practiced speed. One held the foot steady while the other applied traction, pulling gently until the bone shifted back with a muted click. Flint grunted, teeth clenched, sweat blooming across his forehead despite the chill. They wrapped the leg in a synthetic brace that hardened into a rigid shell within seconds. "You'll be non-weight bearing for at least 10 days, the medic said. "Longer if you don't rest." "I plan on doing absolutely nothing," Flint said, head pressing back against the gurney. The assistant slid a nutrient bag into the Roman 4 port. "You'll need calories." "You're borderline hypoglycemic." Flint raised an eyebrow. "I've been eating snow and guilt for 3 days. What do you expect?" Doran stepped closer, container still under one arm. "You should be commended. The others would not have endured." Flint shook his head. "They would have managed." "That plant girl Yilna, she's sharper than she looks. And Hesk, built like a snowplow, you all would have figured something out." Doran was quiet for a moment. "You assume too much about our problem solving under pressure." "Not all species confront adversity with improvisation." Flint turned his head to face him. "You mean panic. I mean paralysis. Not all cultures encourage individual initiative. Many rely on systems." "You acted without awaiting instruction." "I didn't have time to wait." The medic tapped a control panel. "Vitals stabilizing. We'll lift off in 5. You'll be transferred to the orbital station for recovery." Doran took a seat beside the gurney. "You constructed a fire using debris and a magnifier. That's considered primitive technology, yet it preserved our lives." Flint chuckled, then winced. "You say primitive like it's a bad thing. In academic terms, it is. It shouldn't be. It's simple. Not obsolete. You bypassed our survival systems entirely. Because they failed." Doran studied him. "Why do humans prepare for failure with such casual expectation?" Flint looked up at the ceiling. "Because our systems fail all the time. We're used to it." The medic returned with a portable monitor. "Keep your foot elevated. If you feel any numbness, tell someone immediately." "Will do," he said through a yawn. Doran stood. "I will return shortly." Flint watched him leave, then closed his eyes. The steady hum of the ship merged with the throb of his heartbeat. Several hours later, he was woken by the hiss of a docking seal. The orbital med station was cleaner, brighter, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. He was transferred to a private recovery pod, small but warm. A nurse with shimmering scales adjusted the environmental settings to human norms. "You'll be monitored for infection. No food for 6 hours." Flint groaned. "I'll trade you my leg for a sandwich. No trades. Rest." She left with a flick of her tail. The next morning, Doran returned, carrying a narrow console. He pulled up a series of files on the display. "We have replicated your fire-starting method in multiple simulations," he said. "It works in 97% of examined conditions." "Well, that's a solid B+. We intend to propose it as an emergency alternative in planetary excursions." Flint shifted to sitting. "Glad to help. Can I get a cut of the royalties? There are no royalties. It is survival knowledge, figures. Doran hesitated. Some are uncomfortable with the implications. Of what? That a human with no formal training in our methodologies succeeded where our systems failed. Flint leaned back. Maybe it's not about methods. Maybe it's just about being too stubborn to freeze to death. Stubbornness, Doran repeated. That is not a trait we document often. You should start. There was a soft chime. The nurse returned with a small tray. Finally, food. A protein patty, a vitamin gel, and something green and wobbly that Flint didn't want to ask about. He dug in. Doran sat quietly until he finished. Then, without preamble, he asked, "What would you have done if the lens had broken?" Flint paused, swallowing. Used the boot buckle. It's curved and shiny, not as good but might have worked. You had a backup. Always do. Doran nodded slowly. Your people prepare for disaster with options. Yeah, plan A, B, C. Sometimes D through F if we're feeling nervous. We consider redundancy inefficient. Try freezing your exoskeleton off and tell me how efficient that feels. Doran looked away, thoughtful. You are unlike the others. Nah, Flint said, leaning back again. We're all like this. Some just hide it better. There was a moment of stillness, then Doran leaned forward. Will you instruct others? You want me to teach fire making, among other things. Your perspective is unconventional, useful. Flint raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to lecture, not lecture. Demonstrate, share your instincts. Instincts are messy. You sure your people can handle that? No, Doran said. But I believe it will be educational. Flint grinned. All right, but first I want a better chair and a sandwich that doesn't jiggle. Doran stood. I will make the request. As he left, Flint looked down at his leg. The swelling was going down. The cast itched. But his foot was warm, which was more than he could say about earlier that week. He reached toward the tray, picked up the lens Doran had returned, and held it up to the overhead light. The curved glass caught the glow, bending it into a small, focused beam against the wall. He smiled not out of pride but recognition. Even here, floating miles above a frozen planet, the old tool still worked. The third day in orbit began with a dull ache behind Flint's eyes and the distant whine of sterilizers running through the med-pod vents. He blinked up at the low ceiling, which was now tinted a calming shade of blue, apparently calibrated to match mild terrestrial morning. His leg itched like something alive was trapped inside the cast. He resisted the urge to scratch under it with a fork. A knock, not really a knock, more like a polite chime, sounded at the pod door. It hissed open, revealing Doran, who carried a narrow container with a red seal. His bioluminescence had shifted to a pale amber, which Flint had learned meant he was either focused or mildly agitated, possibly both. You're early, Flint said, shifting upright and pulling the blanket off his lap. Or am I late? You are on time. I have been reviewing feedback from the preliminary lectures. Lectures? Flint rubbed his forehead. I gave one 10-minute demo with a piece of glass and a pile of kindling. You're calling that a lecture. They are calling it primitive innovation deployment under duress, Flint groaned. Catchy. There is considerable discussion, Doran continued, setting the container on the counter. Some faculty are skeptical that non-technological improvisation should be formalized in the curriculum. Because it lacks circuitry. Because it cannot be reliably taught. They believe your success was statistical anomaly, not repeatable behavior. Flint reached for the water bulb on his tray and took a long sip. I'd love to meet the committee that thinks survival should be predictable. Doran opened the container, revealing a small array of items. A folded emergency blanket, half a broken reflective panel, a piece of polished alloy curved like a spoon, and a chunk of compressed fiber. He gestured toward them. This is the kit we assembled using only scavenged materials from the shuttle. We want to test your method under controlled conditions. Here, Flint raised an eyebrow, in a sterilized med bay. No, in the simulation hall. We have already adjusted the atmospheric parameters to match throws V, minus the wind speeds. Flint eyed his leg. You realize I'm not exactly hike ready. You will supervise. 2 volunteers will attempt ignition. You will advise only when necessary. And if they fail, we record the failures. Flint sighed, then pushed himself upright. All right, but one condition, Doran tilted his head. I want a proper seat. Something that doesn't feel like I'm riding a shopping cart. Half an hour later, Flint was wheeled into the simulation hall in a padded mobility rig outfitted with thermal controls and a swing-out console. The room had been converted into a scaled mock-up of an ice cavern, complete with uneven terrain, low lighting, and breathable but thin air. The temperature was uncomfortably familiar. Waiting in the center were the two volunteers, one of the avian species with sharply folded wing limbs, and another whose translucent form pulsed with internal light, similar to the medic from earlier. Both wore insulated suits, though this time tailored for maneuverability rather than protection. Names? Flint asked, adjusting the footrest so the brace on his leg stayed elevated. The avian inclined her narrow head. Vel, third-year xenobotanist. Lom, said the other, his voice resonating through a vocalizer. Materials science. All right, Flint said, eyeing the kit Doran had placed before them. You've got one lens substitute, two ignition materials, and a light source. Vel picked up the alloy spoon. This is insufficient curvature for focal convergence. Try anyway, Flint said. You're not here to succeed, you're here to learn what doesn't work. They began assembling a makeshift campfire, layering the fiber and shredded thermal wrap into a cone. Lom angled the spoon fragment toward one of the ceiling lamps. That's an artificial light, Flint said. It doesn't emit the right spectrum. Use the overhead emitter. Vel adjusted the angle. Lom steadied the bundle. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. I don't understand, Lom said. The material should be combustible at this density. It is, Flint replied, but the beam's too diffuse. Your angle's off. Vel repositioned the spoon, then fumbled it. The metal clanged on the ground. Try the broken panel instead, Flint said. It has a better surface. They swapped tools. Lom held the panel steady while Vel aligned the fibers again. This time, a faint wisp of smoke curled upward. Lom leaned in, blowing gently. The ember flared and died. That's your problem, Flint said. Too much air, not enough heat. Let it smolder first. They tried again 3 times. On the 4th, a finger-sized flame took hold. Lom let out a warbling trill that echoed through the chamber. You've got it, Flint said. Now feed it slow, small strips, don't suffocate it. They huddled around the tiny fire, watching it grow to the size of a teacup. Doran stood beside Flint, observing silently. See, Flint said. Repeatable. Doran didn't respond. He stepped forward and addressed the volunteers. Terminate the session. Preserve the materials for analysis. The fire was extinguished with a quick spray of inert foam. The students collected the remnants and left the chamber, still murmuring over the results. Flint sat back in the mobility rig and exhaled. Satisfied, I am, Doran said. Others may require further demonstration. Let them freeze in a cave for 2 days. That'll make believers out of them. Doran paused. You still experience discomfort, the leg, not so much the rest of me. Constantly? I meant emotional distress. Flint turned his head. You're asking if I'm rattled. Yes, I was terrified. That's normal. I just didn't have time to let it stop me. Doran nodded once, then gestured for the rig to be wheeled back to the corridor. Later that evening, Flint sat in the viewing lounge overlooking the station's engineering wing. Below, translucent panels showed the maintenance drones spiraling through zero-G corridors, checking reactor seals and adjusting coolant streams. The stars beyond blinked lazily. Yilna appeared beside him, her fibrous limbs bundled in a new thermal wrap. Her injured joint was braced but flexible now. You endured, she said. I'm starting to resent that word, Flint replied. You altered your surroundings without altering yourself. That is rare among sapients. I didn't have much choice. You had many. He turned toward her. What would you have done? I would have waited for orders. Even with no communication. Yes, Flint shook his head. That's not resilience. That's surrender. It is faith in structure. He didn't respond right away. Then he said, structure doesn't light a fire. She tilted her head. Perhaps not, but now we carry both. They sat in silence for a while, watching the slow drift of drones. By the end of the week, Flint's leg was stable enough for unassisted walking with a cane. He declined an exoskeletal brace, calling it overkill. The medics disagreed, but relented. He limped through his final inspection. answered a series of questions for a hazard debrief, and signed a stack of forms he didn't bother reading. Doran met him at the shuttle bay. A small group of students stood nearby, including Vel and Lom. "We will compile your methods into a field protocol," Doran said. "You will be cited. I feel honored." "You should. Most citations involve fatalities." Flint looked at the departing shuttle. "You heading back to Throws V?" "No, I have been reassigned." Instructional post, teaching fire starting, among other things. Flint extended a hand. Doran hesitated, then took it. "Try not to crash the next one," Flint said. "I will let the pilot know." As he boarded the returning vessel, Flint glanced back one last time. The students were already pulling apart the fire kit, debating material density and curvature angles. The station receded behind the viewport, shrinking to a pinprick against the stars. He leaned back in his seat, stretched his leg carefully, and closed his eyes. For once, everything was warm.